Hi, everyone. In this lecture video, I am going to discuss just the basic concept of the theme of this module period 3, which is the subject we're going to be talking about called conformity. So this video is just going to be a really quick little video to give you an overview of the concept. And then in the following two lecture videos, so the lecture video on social cascades and then the lecture video on group polarization, we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about the different ways that conformity can work. So the basic idea of conformity is that we're doing what other people do. Okay. So the way that I'm going to try to explain this idea to you is through it was a psychology experiment that was done in the 1930s, and the way that the experiment worked is it brought groups of test subjects, groups of people, or like organized test subjects into groups. And individually, members of each group would go into this room where there was no light or very, very little light, with the exception of just like this tiny little pinpoint, like you can imagine going into like kind of a black box room. And then there was just like a little tiny hole, little tiny pinpoint. And through that little pinpoint shone a light. So you just have like one little pinpoint of light coming out. And people stood in the room, again, individually, they were alone, and they were told to just look at the light, and they were asked to guess as to how much they thought the light moved throughout this experiment. So the trick here was sort of that the light didn't move at all. It stayed in the same place. But under conditions like that, the way that like we experience sight, like the way that our visual experiences work, it's going to give the illusion that the light is moving. Okay. So we know for a fact none of these people saw any light that was moving. Nonetheless, they were asked to make a guess as to how much they thought the light moved. So, what they found, so they would finish that, and then they would go. I mean, I'm kind of this isn't exactly how it worked, but the basic idea is that they would sit in this dark room, watch this light, and then they leave the room, and then by themselves they would sit down and like write down how much they thought the light moved. And then the second part of the experiment was they'd get together, everybody in the group, and that was assigned to the same group would get together, and they would discuss, how much do you think the light moved? Okay. So what we see in this experiment is a lot of conformity, where we saw individual people sort of following along with the crowd, doing what others do. So the first sort of round of this experiment, so they did this with like multiple groups of people, they found that, no matter how much the individual judgments differed, so how much, you have like the group of people, so there's 5 people in a group, right? And then after they sat in the dark room, looked at the light, when they went into the next room and sat down and wrote down individually how much they thought the light moved, say those 5 different people may have had very different, significantly different guesses as to how much they thought the light moved, But no matter how much the individual judgments differed in the beginning, after discussion, people, after like they talked about how much they thought perhaps it moved with like other people in the group, individuals in the group would conform, their judgments would conform. They'd come together and they'd be like, yeah, actually, I think that it moved maybe about 4 feet, for example. And they weren't just saying, oh, our group decided that we think it moved 4 feet. And then, they walked off privately and thought to themselves, oh, I think that it actually probably only moved 2 feet. After conversation, everybody in the group, like, no matter how different their initial judgments were, they really felt, after talking to other people, they like genuinely changed their mind. They came to some sort of group consensus where their opinions or their beliefs about how much that light moved, what they thought about that, was effectively the same thing as what they saw other people saying it was, right? They were doing what other people do. So, that was in the first round of the test. In the second round of the experiment, you got a fresh, brand new group of people. And within that new group of people, or within each of these new groups, the people running the experiment, the scientists or psychologists running the experiment, put in what is called in psychology a confederate in the study. So, or they added a confederate to each group. And for those of you who are not psychology majors, a confederate is someone, a confederate in like a psychological experiment like this or a sociological experiment like this is someone who they come in and they pretend as though they are just like everybody else. They're just another participant in the study, when in reality, they're secretly working with the people who are running the experiment to kind of try to change things in some particular way. And in this case, the way that they were changing it was they would go in, once we got to the point in the experiment where everybody was having a group discussion about their judgments concerning how much the light moved, and they would kind of wait and see, what the different judgments were. And then they would present either a like significantly higher guess as to what everybody else had said. So let's again say there's 5 people in this experiment. Person number person number 5 is the confederate. So let's say person number 1 said, "Oh, I think it moved a foot." Person number 2 said, "I think that it moved 3 feet." Person number 4 said, person number 3 said that I think it moved 3 feet. And person number 4 said, I think that it moved 4 feet. Okay. So we have between 1 and 4 feet. And so under those kinds of circumstances, the confederate was told to go either significantly higher or significantly lower. So let's pretend in this example, the confederate went significantly higher, and they said, "Oh, I think it moved 10 feet. Okay. And what they found pretty consistently, this is one of these rare psychology experiments where they have been able to replicate this study. So this is something that psychologists have done over and over again since the 1930s when the experiment was initially run. And we find pretty consistent results in this second outcome in the second round of experiments when these confederates did the like significantly higher guess or significantly lower guess. What we find typically is that this would render correspondingly higher or lower judgments within the group. So you got people initially guessing, right, between 1 and I think 4 feet, right? And if you introduce another person who's sort of confidently saying, actually, I think it's 10, what the scientists found, what the psychologists found, was that the entire group would end up shifting their guess up. They would say maybe that they thought that it was like 5 or 6. That was the group consensus they eventually came to. So people seem to respond quite a bit to these confederates who also presented their information in a very confident manner. So one important thing to think about here too is, the level of confidence that someone shows when they're discussing these sorts of things, coming to a group consensus about these sorts of things that seem to have a pretty significant effect on where people ended up making their guesses as to how much the light moved. Now, they did a sort of third round of these experiments where had the confederate attempting to do this thing of doing the significantly higher, significantly lower guess to sort of like shift the general consensus either up or down in terms of the consensus guess at how much the light moved. But in this third round of experiments, what the scientists or the psychologists did was they told the other people in the non-Confederates of the group, so the true participants, they told them that the Confederate, which they didn't tell them there was a Confederate in the experiment, they were saying, okay, oh, right, so all four of you say, belong to like the same group, like you're all, for instance, psychology majors. Now, say like Joseph, the fifth person in the group, who's also another participant in the study, he's actually a history major. So here they were sort of marking out someone whose membership to a different social group is made salient. That is really like sticking out information, presented information to the rest of the group, like really marked this like, okay, so the one thing to know about all of your group members is that the four of you are psychology majors and this one person is a history major. That's what making something salient means. So what they found in this third round of studies is no matter how confident the Confederate was in their guess of like, say like, oh, well, I actually think it moved 10 feet. I actually only think it moved a couple of inches, right? Like high or low, trying to shift the general consensus. For the most part, if they were marked out as like an out group person, they were kind of othered initially in the experiment to the rest of the group. Those effects that shift up or that shift down didn't happen. So no matter how confident they were, if they were marked as like an out-group person, their opinion didn't seem to really affect the consensus of the group. So what does that mean? What's going on here? Well, first of all, if a number of people think that a proposition is true, that gives them reason to think that that gives everyone else. So say you're like standing in that group of 5, you have 4 people saying a proposition, something is true. That gives you reason to think that that thing is true, right? Because you have everybody else's information sort of like you have like people that are that you're the assumption being that you have those 4 different people that have their own reasons, their own information that they're coming to these opinions on. They've all converged on it, they all agree on it, and that essentially works as really good evidence to us, or that appears to us as really good evidence to think that what the group is saying is actually true. Okay. And this is something that really hits us hard when what we feel to be relevant information is lacking, and or we might feel uncertain about about our initial judgment. So the sensory perception experiment is a really perfect example here, because we know that we just have this illusion of the light moving in the dark room, right? It didn't actually move, or rather, we know now looking back on it, but the people participating in the study obviously did not know that. In fact, they were told the light did move. And because it's this illusory thing, they didn't really feel certain about the judgments they initially drew after walking out of the room and saying how much they thought the light moved. So under circumstances like that, where people feel like, well, I don't really know about this thing, I'm not really feeling confident about the stuff that I do know, it appears that they're really susceptible. That's when people are especially susceptible for following with the crowd, doing what others do, i.e., conforming. Another thing that this experiment tells us about conformity is that sometimes confidence, which comes with sometimes being an expert, right? Like maybe if somebody came in and said, you know, like I'm a sharpshooter, that's like a hobby of mine, right? I'm really good at like identifying targets and figuring out how much stuff moves. That's the reason why I feel really confident in my judgment and saying how much I thought the light moved, right? Somebody could be an expert and as a result feel really confident about the answers they came to. But even if they're not experts, right? They didn't do anything like that in these sensory perception experiments. just a show of confidence. These Confederates that came in, it's like, no, I'm absolutely certain it moved 10 feet, right? It really can, just that confidence alone, which again can sometimes stem from being an expert, but in this case, this experiment, not always. And that confidence alone can really influence the individual judgments made within the group, right? Because they all came to a consensus, but like I mentioned before, people, once they came to that consensus, people really believed it. They actually changed their minds. They came in maybe saying, oh, I think it moved 1 foot, 2 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. And then by the end of the discussion, when you had that confident, like secret scientist in the experiment saying, no, I think it moved 10, they walked away being like, oh, no, I really think it moved 6 feet, right? Like more than they really had anticipated. They definitely changed their minds. And the fourth sort of takeaway that we learned from this experiment about conformity is that as soon as somebody in a group is othered, like they're marked out as someone who doesn't belong to the group, someone that shouldn't be trusted, someone that perhaps is disliked, right? Like you can imagine people, fans of different sports teams, right? Like, oh, that person's a Jets fan, for example, like in football. Or that person's a Red Sox fan, like in baseball. Say you're like a Yankees fan or Giants fan, right? Like you might have some pretty strong opinions. You might not really trust or really like somebody who is a really hardcore fan from like a rival team. And as soon as we mark someone like that out in a group, we other someone like that, the whole group is far less likely to be influenced by that one person. And this is something that we also want to keep in mind too, when we're just thinking about these different ways that conformity works throughout the rest of this module period, where sometimes we do have really good experts, people with sound knowledge we don't have, good information, and that person might get ignored by a group of people coming to some judgment simply because that person is marked out as like as somebody we don't trust, somebody we don't like. Okay. So what are the takeaway here? What are the takeaways here? In this module period, we're going to be thinking about the way that conformity, these tendencies to conform, some of these behaviors, these circumstances that I just described with respect to this experiment, impacts our ability to think critically or impact our critical reasoning capacities. So in the previous module period, we learned about what good arguments look like, right? We learned how to break those down. We learned how to analyze and assess them or evaluate them. We learned a little bit about fallacies and the way that reasoning and these patterns by which our either deductive or non-deductive reasoning skills can like go awry, get messed up. And now, starting with this module period and the remaining module periods for the rest of the course, we're going to be looking at other factors that can sort of maybe make us susceptible to believing certain fallacies, or things that can really just undermine that critical reasoning process that you learned about in the last module period, in module period 2. Essentially like different psychological, social, technological, structural, institutional factors that can really undermine our ability to look at the evidence, critically assess it, and think about whether or not the evidence for a particular argument actually provides sufficient support for the conclusion. So in this case, in this module period, we're going to be looking at this tendency that we have to do what others do, to go along with the crowd. And we're going to be thinking about, okay, what are the ways in which conformity, this tendency, this psychological tendency we have to conform, what are the ways in which it can lead us astray? Because, and this is an important thing to think about, because the stuff we take to know, like facts about morality, the law, um, like the physical state of the world, right, is not a product of firsthand knowledge, but it comes from things that we learn about what others do and think, right? Like textbooks, this video, going to college. I think to arguably like things we see on Instagram, things we see on TikTok, right? Google, hopefully not too much ChatGPT, but sometimes ChatGPT, right? We're really like going along with things that we feel like a lot of other people are saying, and kind of there's the facts we know about the world, certain moral truths we take to be true, and definitely a lot of our beliefs about the way the law, like what constitutes a law, what a law is, what the laws are, how laws work, those sorts of things, the way that our country is governed. A lot of those beliefs that we have are rooted in things that we have heard other people say, things that we, see other people doing, right? And just that, and a lot of the time we form those beliefs because we see, okay, if there's a bunch of people doing something, or there's somebody that I really identify with doing something a certain way or thinks a certain thing, that gives me good evidence to do that thing or think that thing that they're saying is true, right? And that can serve us well sometimes, and we're going to talk about that in the next two lecture videos, especially when our information is limited or we have a good reason to trust an expert, so maybe like our parents growing up, you feel like your parent has a really strong, good moral compass and they raised you with like a good, strong sense of morality, right? Just going along with what they say, especially in the beginning when they're like teaching us these lessons, can be really beneficial, right? However, sometimes it can also be really harmful. Like when we hold back and don't share information that might be really relevant, that goes against what the crowd is saying, goes against somebody we respect what they're saying. And that's really, really bad when our beliefs or thoughts that we have based on that evidence kind of that goes against the crowd are beliefs that are true, or thoughts, opinions that are right, that are good, right? So when we hold that back, we don't tell the group about what's going on. Those, as we'll discuss, can have some pretty seriously bad downstream effects. So the basic takeaway here between the general concept of this module period and like the theme of the course overall, critical reasoning, is that we're going to want to be thinking about where and when we should try to resist the effects of conformity and thus make better decisions and hopefully be better critical thinkers. Okay, so that about does it for this little introduction to our new module period. And feel free to reach out, email me if you have any questions. All right.